Okay, I think we're all here and ready to go for the next session. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the next session, the first panel session, Bodies of Water. And I can understand why Judith asked me to chair this session, even though the timing is not the best.
Okay.
The fact of Bodies of Water, and that being what I've been working on most of my life. Anyway, so it's great that we've got two papers which are related and distinct. The first one will be from Christina Mendes, and I'll just introduce her and then introduce her title. She's an Associate Professor in English Studies at the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Lisbon. And she uses cultural and post-colonial studies to examine literary and schooling texts, in particular intermediate adaptations, as venues for resistant knowledge formations to expand upon theories of epistemic injustice. Her research interests are vast over visual culture, post-colonial theory, adaptation studies, and Victorian afterlives. Specifically, the global post-colonial dimensions of Victorianism and its fandoms and extractive economies. I'd just like to say that I've read Anna's work in the past. It's great that she's here and great that we can hear it live. And her title today is Atlantic Expeditions, the Mediterranean Refugee Crisis and the Pitfalls of Transhistoricity in Adaptations of Théodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa, which is also, of course, one of my favourite pictures. So over to Anna now.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan, for this introduction. Oh, sorry. I need we need a sign for that. Like we need to be very close. Okay, especially us soft-spoken people. Okay, is it? No, is it better? Sort of. Yes, Théodore Géricault, The Raft of the Medusa, is a favorite of many, and it has had many afterlives, and this paper is, in broad terms, on these afterlives and how these have been reused, how this painting, this iconic painting has been reused to evoke some sort of effective response regarding the refugee crisis. And in general, the adaptation of iconic images, and Théodore Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa is one of them, has been a typical artistic move to reflect the harrowing journeys of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea in search of better lives. So I'll start with Susan Sontag and her work on photography, especially her book regarding the pain of others, where she wrote on the memory work iconic photographs of Jewish suffering and death during the Holocaust performed. So this kind of memory work that iconic photographs perform. And this is an entryway to address how iconic images resonate with us, to offer, in ways that offer a socially engaged representation of, in this case, the refugee crisis. And here you have a quote from Sontag that I'll read out. To aim at the perpetuation of memories means inevitably that one has undertaken the task of continually renewing, of creating memories aided, above all, by the impress of iconic photographs. People want to be able to visit and refresh their memories. So earlier in her book, Sontag comments on how images of dead or suffering bodies are strategically selected, exhibited, and distributed, and how someone else's pain is turned into an object of gaze for a political purpose through framing or cropping and retouching the image of that pain of others, again, to go back to the title of her book. Specifically, Sontag is referring to images. She gives the example of the faces of North American dead soldiers, of whom of whose faces we are not allowed to see. The quote specifically is, with our dead, North American dead, there has always been a powerful interdiction against showing the naked face. So this shows how this framing and cropping and retouching the pain of others is strategic, of course, and has a political purpose. So I started with Sontag's reflection on the power of iconicity in photography as effective resonance and as performing memory work to frame this presentation's focus on the transhistorical continuums that adaptation in the sense of reusing, refurbishing, re-signifying, adaptations in particular of Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa. And the focus is on the forging of a continuum, a transhistorical continuum between the violences exerted on the others of Euro-Atlantic modernity, and here I'm referencing Ian Bauckham, and imperial accumulation, and the others of the Mediterranean refugee crisis. So we are drawing on the power of iconicity to paraphrase Sontag again, cultivate the perpetuation of memories and intensify our effective response to the current plight of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea in a way to combat indifference. And speaking of indifference, I now would like to resort to Tugba Bazaram in a 2015 article on the refugee crisis entitled "The Saved and the Drowned, Governing Indifference in the Name of Security." And she argues that, and I quote, "the drowned are not casualties of individual immoral behavior," end of quote. So Bazaram argues that individual complacency, which will allow state actions of indifference towards the drowned in the Mediterranean to continue, this complacency is itself a form of immorality fostered by the state. And I quote from her again, "Through a system of sanctions, fellow human beings are encouraged to look away and even to let people die at borders in the name of security," and unquote, and of course to let people drown at sea. Sorry, and not... Thank you. So this indifference, Bazaram further argues, has impacted the normative landscape. Quoting from her again, "by authorizing distinctions in humanity, defining who is worthy of rescue and who is not," end of quote. And of course, by extension, we can think of thinking of whose lives are grievable and ungrievable. So of course, I'm drawing on Judith Butler, whose lives are charitable and uncharitable, who may live and who must die. Of course, drawing on Mendes' necropolitics, almost through a biological caesura, and this is Mendes' words, that had been previously enacted between the ones and the others. So when individuals look away, their indifference serves as an alibi for the structural violence of the state, its necropolitics and its camouflaged violences and attending scapegoats. And this to speak of these scapegoats and how they are used, I'm drawing on René Girard, and how he writes that society is seeking to deflect upon a relatively indifferent victim, a sacrificable victim, the violence that would otherwise be vented on its own members, the people it most desires to protect, end of quote. So this presentation was initially inspired by Yogita Goyal's 2017 article, an article entitled "The Logic of Analogy," and this resonated a lot with me because of my work in adaptation. "The Logic of Analogy," subtitle "Slavery and the Contemporary Refugee." So this analogy between slavery and the contemporary refugee. And she probes the uses of transhistorical analogies between black enslavement and the Middle Passage and the Mediterranean refugee crisis. And of course, a special thanks goes to Elsa Gomez for giving me this reference, and others. We in fact have been working on a co-authored article for the intervention special issue for this project, and it has been very, very fruitful. So when Géricault's large-scale canvases was first unveiled at the Salon of 1819 in Paris, it was met with controversy on account of its abject, shocking representation of dead bodies. In 1816, the Medusa, the ship depicted in the painting, was en route to Senegal to re-establish French rule over the colony when it ran aground along the coast of present-day Mauritania. Pairing the raft of the Medusa with its various recent afterlives that conjure an analogy between the Medusa shipwreck in the early 19th century and the capsized boats in the Mediterranean in the early 21st century invited, for me, a reflection on the ongoing legacies of Atlantic imperial expeditions as racial capitalism. I'm drawing on Cedric Robson, the violence inextricable from the history of Euro-Atlantic modernity, and specifically what Bauckham calls an Atlantic cycle of accumulation, and in his work, The Spectres of the Atlantic. Another reference that I would like to make here is Denise Ferreira da Silva in her theoretical framework of Black poetics, where she likewise draws attention to the entanglement of colonial and mercantile interests that characterizes racial capitalism, when she underscores how the wounded flesh, and this is her expression, wounded flesh, as a narrative of the calculated violence, another expression by Denise Ferreira da Silva, of enslavement, and I quote from her, registers what the category of blackness hides, living, dead capital profiting from the expropriated productive capacity of enslaved bodies and native lands, end of quote. So besides underscoring racial capitalism and the violences of Euro-Atlantic modernity, at the same time, and using Goyal's words, the logic of analogy deployed in these adaptations of the Raft of the Medusa and their reception offer the potential to ask us to confront the potential pitfalls of transhistoricity in the conflation of past and present, and I think in a way that also relates to your presentation. And in adaptation in general. Also, she talks about the conflation also of a hegemonic global north and a perpetually marginalized global south when she talks about these pitfalls of transhistoricity in these analogies. So I started with Sontag because this quote also points to the necropolitical continuum that characterizes the experience of the Holocaust, black enslavement, racialized violence, and the refugee crisis. And this takes me to Toni Morrison's guest curation at the Louvre in 2006 as part of the museum's The Foreigner Homes program. As you can see, Géricault's painting was at the center of this intervention. And of course, this museum intervention prefigured one much more visible intervention, which was Jay-Z rapping in front of the painting as part of the Carter's Apeshit music video that I'm sure many of you have seen. An act of audiovisual recuration, as I argue in a co-authored article, and apologies for self-promotion, that will be published very shortly in Postcolonial Studies as an Afro-Surrealist art of recuration. So in the music video, I'm sure that many have seen, Jay-Z briefly gazes up at the apex of Géricault's composition, the muscular black sailor figure, and a human figure that was absent in the first sketch of Géricault's painting, who rises above the pile and holds a flag in the delusional hope. Sorry, you cannot see it very much here, sorry, but I would like to keep Jay-Z in the picture. So this black sailor figure rises above the pile and holds a flag in the delusional hope that the ship on the horizon will rescue those who have been stranded by the shipwreck. This heroic black figure epitomizes the hope of survival amid tragedy. The inclusion of this black character has widely been interpreted, as we all know, as an expression of Géricault's loose abolitionist tendencies, and the Raft of the Medusa was used largely as a symbol to support white anti-slavery agitation. Of course, this can be contentious. Throughout his rap part, the video's montage equates Jay-Z with the black sailor figure at the pinnacle of the painting's composition. Jay-Z screens himself in front of the faceless torchbearer and, through a transhistoricizing move, self-stylizes as a 21st century icon who stands in that black figure's lineage and as someone who potentially leads the way out of the shipwrecks of black captivity, colonialism, and racial capitalism, which is awkward to be in the same sentence with Jay-Z, but it's different, right? So another reference that I would like to bring to the presentation is Christina Sharp in her 2016 book, drawing a compelling analogy between enslavement, specifically the experience of the slave ship, and global illegalized migration that allows us to understand how enslavement remains encoded, albeit transformed, a specter even, in the neoliberal discourse about the refugee crisis. In this respect, Derrida's concept of the specter in Spectres of Marx comes to mind, strengthening a parallel between the refugee crisis and the specters of European colonialism. The latter contracts the relation of life and death into a central instance of camp thinking, an exclusive formation of subjectivity that incites hostility between self and other. This is Derrida. For Sharp, there is a transhistorical continuum where, and I quote from Sharp, the semiotics of the slave ship continue from the forced movements of the enslaved to the forced movements of the migrant and refugee. Before Sharp, of course, Paul Gilroy in The Black Atlantic had already deployed a ship metaphor to represent the black experience of forced transatlantic movement. The image of the ship, Gilroy argued, and I'm quoting, is a living microcultural, micropolitical system in motion, end of quote. Still, as Goyal queries in her scrutinizing of the purchasing of historical analogies to slavery, between slavery and the refugee crisis, probing these analogies between black enslavement, the Middle Passage, and the refugee crisis, she asks, and I think this is a very pertinent question, does seeing the contemporary refugee as a specter of the Atlantic slave summon up the ethical claim of the past on us? And this takes us back again to the adaptations of Géricault's painting as potentially summoning up the ethical claim of the past on us, using Goyal's words. For example, Banksy, while at the Jungle refugee camp in the vicinity of Calais from 2015 to 16, adapted Géricault's iconic painting into a stencil. The survivors from the 1816 shipwreck off the coast of Maritime, the shipwreck of the Medusa, who I recall was a French frigate heading to Saint-Louis during the rule French rule to capture Senegal from the British after the Napoleonic Wars, are transformed into modern-day migrants asking for help from a luxury yacht on the horizon. So, of course, both artworks are clearly politically confrontational in their depiction of human suffering and death, underscoring the financial imperatives behind this human suffering. As in Géricault's pro-abolitionist painting, there is already a pile of corpses on Banksy's Raft. Speech bubbles coming from those who are still alive feature the pound symbol. Of the more than 100 men and one woman that the officers put on board the raft of the Medusa, made of wood scraps from the sinking ship after it had run into a sandbar to lessen the weighting down of the ship, only 15 survived after 13 days at sea. Others, deemed more worthy of salvaging, had occupied the places on the lifeboats of the Medusa. The migrants in Banksy's stencil realize the yacht will not come to their rescue. Another example, just very briefly, that I would like to show of a resignification of Géricault's epic painting is Scottish-Guyanese Jason de Caires Taylor's underwater 2016 sculpture, The Raft of Lampedusa, depicting a boat carrying 13 refugees on display in the Museo Atlántico off the coast of Lanzarote, Spain. Here is another picture, and here is Taylor casting one of the figures, and this model was in fact a migrant from Senegal who, at the time of when the picture was taken, living in Lampedusa. So Medusa becomes Lampedusa. Medusa becomes Lampedusa, part of the Pelagi Islands at the southernmost part of Italy, the small refugee island off the coast of Libya. While the island saw a large-scale influx of migrants from the African continent since 2000, it was in 2013 that it became a hotspot for entry in the European Union. And of course, we are all reminded of the 2013 Lampedusa migrant shipwreck, which killed 366 migrants who were on board an overcrowded fishing boat. So as you can see in this picture, Taylor used the actual bodies of migrants to cast the figures for the raft of Lampedusa, which makes this a particularly effective example of an adaptation of Géricault's painting. Besides Taylor's sculpture, another example of a refugee crisis afterlife of the raft of the Medusa includes Sergei Ponomarev's photo of refugees arriving by boat on Lesbos, and captured on 16 of November 2015, and I thank Elsa again for this reference. And just to finish, using Goyal's words again, the logic of analogy deployed in these adaptations of the Raft of the Medusa and their reception also potentially asks us to confront the pitfalls of transhistoricity in this conflation of past and present, in this conflation between a hegemonic global north and a perpetually marginalized global south. I believe that despite the effective resonance that iconic images of suffering effect, shock, as Sontag reminds us, can lose its resonance. The functional quality of shock is, as shock itself, relational. As Sontag writes, and I quote, "For photographs to accuse and possibly to alter conduct, they must shock," end of quote. However, shock as a political tool of indictment, protest, and change can lose its effectiveness as shock can wear off. Besides, as Sontag continues, even if it doesn't, one cannot look. People have means to defend themselves against what is upsetting. end of quote. And I think this is interesting for us to think in terms of, to go back to the beginning of my presentation, in terms of indifference, resonance, and how these analogies, in a way, if they are able to, in fact, alter conduct and combat indifference. So that was what I wanted to say. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we'll take questions at the end, so we'll go on to the next paper. So thank you, Anna, for keeping us time as well.
No. No. Yeah, it doesn't seem to.
Oh, that's it. Thank you so much. Eva Macura-Nnamdi is Assistant Professor at the University of Literary Studies, University of Silesia, Poland. Her main research interests include post-colonial Anglophone literature of Africa, refugees and migration in cinema and literature. She's currently working on a book project provisionally titled Fictions of Water, Refugees and the Sea. She's also guest co-editing a special issue of the journal Angelicae devoted to water. Her paper today is called Saving, Slavery and Refugees at the Maritime Borders of Europe. Thank you, Eva.
I begin this essay. Sabina, can you hear? Yeah? I begin this essay with Banksy, whom I read as a setting for the stage of for Helen Habila and his literary dialogue with the past and the present. Aiming to ponder the recurring comparisons between slavery and the current so-called refugee crisis, I examine his novel and the context in which it arises as extending beyond an exposure to death. You have the image I will be addressing in the handout. On the 1st of December 2019, Banksy announces a competition involving an item from his preposterous and cheeky theme park called Dismaland. The item at stake is a sculpture of a boat overfull with figures of refugees, expressionless and motionless, as if ossified in a quiet acceptance of the coming catastrophe. What Banksy offers to the smartest bidder is the boat itself. As he explains is in his Instagram post, quote, "I'm raffling one of the boats from Dismaland for £2 at www.choose.love. To win the boat, one has to do some reckoning. Quote, just guess how much it weighs," Banksy continues, completing the offer with the following details. Fully remote controlled, top speed 3 knots, batteries included. Raffled off to appeal for donations, the boat served to raise money and consciousness. The donations were meant to support a shop which sells practical items to support refugees in need. Thus, through an unlimited number of guesses, the never-saved boat literally and repeatedly saved manifold lives and livelihoods. Indeed, saving seems what motivates Banksy and what Banksy must have hoped would in the same way motivate others. Yet the dismal pond, with its flotsam migrants and packed boats, is also a site for an entertaining reproduction of the will to save. "Come on, let's get these people to safety," says one journalist to a visitor of the park in one of the many films about Dismaland available on the internet. The mock sea rescue, enacted for fun as a coin-operated fantasy of benevolence and power, reproduces that will without actually saving anyone. Indeed, not saving anyone is part of this recreational morality. The intended futility of saving is inscribed into the architecture of the pond itself. circumscribed by wooden boards and what looks like an imitation of precipitous cliffs on one of its sides. The pond offers no wharf for the boats to moor. Left to bounce off the imaginary shores and cliffs or bump into one another and the drifting, drowned bodies, the remote-controlled boats are an endless repetition of disaster, filmed and photographed by the gathered spectators. The logic that drives Banksy's diorama is propelled by a juxtaposition between death, the floating bodies beyond redemption, and life, the boat or the boats. On one hand, the installation asks the visitors to come to the refugees' rescue, yet in advance renders them unsavable. What is interesting to note here is how this impossibility becomes an outcome of the circumstances rather than of anyone's actions or intentions, irrespective of how many coins one throws into the slots and how compassionate one feels. Forever prevented from arriving at the rocky shore, the boats can only float aimlessly and independently of anyone's responsibility and control. Indeed, death must remain vital so it can animate the will to save. On the other hand, however, to make the effort of saving worthwhile and sustainable, Banksy's artwork must also hold the promise of survival, operate on the assumption that living at sea must be sustained, even if no conditions on land exist to prolong it. Yet Banksy also departs from or modifies the necropolitical take on the Mediterranean. His diorama does forcefully insist on moving and living migrants. After all, its moral as well as artistic message is based on a call to rescue. Most significantly, though, Banksy's art piece shifts focus from the refugees' proximity to death towards the political valence of their life at sea. In her essay titled The Logic of Analogy, Slavery and the Contemporary Refugee, I'm also referencing this work, Yogita Goyal cautions about unproblematic transfers of the conceptions of Black humanity, as she calls that, across time and space, and the ways they render contemporary contexts derivative and essentialized. Heeding these calls for an attentive reading of the affinities shared by slavery and the contemporary Mediterranean, this essay proposes to seek analogies not in on the Black bodies at sea, that's a phrase from Goyal, the way their confinement to unseaworthy ships and inhuman conditions suggest the conversion of human beings into cargo associated with the Middle Passage, but in the relations brought into being between these Black and brown bodies and other involved actors, and in the values and sentiments thus generated, rather than suggesting that the analogy lies in their common experience of anti-Black violence originating in the times of chattel slavery. I would like to seek this analogy in what Tim Armstrong has called the logic of slavery. What Armstrong suggests is a reading of slavery where it is not only history and experience, but also a way of thinking. As he expounds it, there is more to be said about the figural implications of slavery's presence in Western tradition, the way it subtly infiltrates the fabric of other modes of thoughts and shapes what is thinkable, informing what could be called a culture of slavery. And you have these quotes in the handout. Armstrong claims that the culture of slavery is both historical and discursive and entails binding slavery to the way we see a range of economic, social, and legal relations. This essay takes saving as a practice based on one such mode of thinking. It looks at the 18th century insurance practice and in particular probes the meanings of saving that emerge from the general average, a concept of marine insurance, which legally enabled the Zong massacre. It suggests that contemporary acts of saving in the Mediterranean derive their logic from what saving meant in 18th century moral and economic sentiments underlying insurance theory and practice. Reading Helen Habila's 2019 novel Travelers, alongside Banksy and Frontex policies, I examine how Habila's text speaks to and of the inherited paradigm of saving, rescripting the refugees' weight towards death, it's a phrase from Christina Sharp, into the political and economic utility of their life. Doing so also brings to light and helps to formulate a set of other claims. That drownings in the Mediterranean are not exceptional, that to keep some bodies as structurally beyond saving is a form of border control, and that the scenes of rescue that unfold at sea redefine refugees as those who failed to arrive. While 18th and early 19th century humanitarian discourses, Armstrong tells us, revolved around the scene of rescue, which envisaged slaves as shipwrecked lives in need of saving, what interests me more here is a moral scene, another moral scene, one also unfolding at sea and deriving from the 18th century culture of insurance, more specifically from the concept called general average. John Westcott's 1781 complete digest of the theory, law, and practice of insurance provides a more extensive definition of the principle. I'm quoting it in the handout as well. Whatever the master of a ship in distress deliberately resolves to do for the preservation of the whole, in cutting away masts or cables, or in throwing goods overboard to lighten his vessel, which is what is meant by jettison, is, in all places, permitted to be brought into a general or gross average, in which all concerned in ship, freight, and cargo are to bear an equal or proportionable part of what was so sacrificed for the common good, and it must be made good by the insurers in such proportions as they have underwrote. However, to make this action legal, the three following points are essentially necessary. That what was so condemned to destruction was in consequence of a deliberate and voluntary consultation held between the master and man. That the ship was in distress and the sacrificing of the things they did was a necessary procedure to save the rest. That the saving of the ship and the cargo was actually owing to the means used with that sole view. Westcott's definition of the general average brings into being a number of entities and values. It constitutes a community, the subjects and beneficiaries of the common good appealed to in the definition, brought about by contingently established interests. It is this community that is subsequently in the position to calculate and regain the value lost at sea. Westcott's theory of the general average ascribes a moral imperative to the ineluctable destruction that awaits the ship and the cargo in distress, replaces individual with collective good, and quite explicitly suggests that something less calculable than the costs of the proportionable part is at stake. The almost altruistic impulse ascribed to the master of a ship, who is empowered to act for the preservation of a whole, and who must thus destroy what is also his in the face of overwhelming necessity, renders this saving from losing by destroying an exercise as much in economy as in ethics. It is also important to note how the act of saving, necessitated and defined by the logic of insurance, advances a number of other more important claims. To save is to deliberately leave something unsaved. To save is also simultaneously to destroy. The destruction of something a priori deemed beyond redemption underlies the saving of the ship. To save is to preserve life and loss value. Thus to save is to weld the moral and the economic. And finally, to save is to keep hidden from view a tautology that implicitly defines the preservation of the whole. In a sense, one saves what is beforehand considered and recognized as safe from destruction. One can see this tautology at work in the Zong case, recounting some of the legal arguments deployed during the trial. Armstrong notes the question of the non-random nature of the selection of the slaves, an issue that was of crucial importance given that the general average applies to situations of emergency where one seizes the goods nearest to hand for jettison rather than carefully sorts out the cheapest cargo. Had the selection been random, it was argued it would have met the criteria of the general average, but the jettisoned slaves had been chosen rather than seized arbitrarily. If within the maritime practice there always were, despite the contingent circumstances calling for random rather than deliberate choices, quote from Armstrong, bodies of the socially and commercially dispensable, bodies which disappear, there were likewise bodies subject to saving, savable, and thus already understood to be safe. Emerging from the logic of the general average this paradigm entails, is a division into savable and unsavable bodies. It requires, this logic, the dispensable bodies to delineate this division and retroactively to construct the safety of those who are not condemned to destruction. Helen Habilo's most recent novel, Travelers, offers a story which exposes the paradigm of saving as it re-emerges, revised across the Mediterranean in the current so-called refugee crisis. The novel mostly takes the perspective of an unnamed narrator who is a Nigerian PhD student currently residing in Berlin with his American wife, an artist on a prestigious fellowship. As the narrative unfolds, we see him cross paths with the other characters whom he meets on his way, to whose stories he attentively and sympathetically listens and whose struggles he sometimes joins. These encounters take him from Berlin to Basel, then to a refugee camp in Italy, then home to Nigeria via Libya, to the US, and finally to London, where together with his Zambian girlfriend, Portia, he meets and decides to assist Juma, a Nigerian asylum seeker, on hunger strike and to be deported. The novel ends with a letter written by Juma in a detention center to the narrator and Portia, the former envisaging Juma's impending death. The Sea, Book 5 of Habilo's novel, opens with one of its main characters, Matteo, reimagining a scene of rescue that will constitute not only its narrative backbone, but also another story, itself subject to narration, a story Matteo will recount to the narrator in the course of the book. Narrated from alternating points or perspectives, Matteo's and the narrators, the book tells the story of both the latter's sojourn at a refugee camp on an unnamed island and Matteo's rescue of a female refugee and his subsequent relationship with her. In fact, Matteo happens to also save the narrator, apparently engulfed by a resignation to the fate that befell him. Offering refuge, Matteo tells him of how he chanced upon, took home, and tended a female refugee and her son. Unable to remember who she is, the woman is finally supplied and named by Matteo, who invents a story of their past encounter. Now, desperate to have an identity, she believes Matteo's told tales, accepting to marry him soon after. Expectedly enough, she comes to recover her memory, leaving the despairing Matteo in order to search for her husband she hopes survived the sea crossing. The Sea begins with Matteo recalling her beached, lifeless, Aphrodite-like body and arrival. Quote, as he drove down the sloping road to the camp, he caught a glimpse of the sea below. The southern Italian sun was gleaming on the waves, and for a moment it all came back, the woman lying half-covered in the foaming waves on the beach, and he running toward her. At first he thought she was dead. End of quote. Alongside this romanticized recollection lies a brief but vivid description of the sea. Quote, today the sea was restless, roiling and snapping at the foot of the hill, spouting foam like an enraged leviathan, unquote. The contrast between the mercy and the ferocity of the sea is significant for the implication it carries about the provenance of the violence that has befallen the woman, suggesting that containing it lies beyond human powers and that its infliction remains unrelated to any conditions beyond the realm of the sea. It therefore naturalizes this violence, reducing survival to a matter of miracle, something depending on the vagaries of the sea and one's ability to brave them. To be saved means to have withstood the elemental frenzy of the seawater, something that countless images of black subjects in conditions of radical precarity, struggling for survival against nature rather than the border regime, evidence again and again. Echoing the logic of 18th century maritime insurance, Habila's narrative underscores the refugees' disappearance before their journeys begin and points to the way they are, to rephrase Ian Baucom, regarded to have vanished prior to the moment of their drowning. Thus, when she finally recovers her memory, Sophia, as Matteo named her, recalls her name and the circumstances of the crossing, recounting in horrific detail the disaster that befell them. Quote, "I was scared. I didn't want all four of us on the same boat. The boat was really nothing but a death trap. And an old rickety fishing trawler that should have been retired a long time ago. Some who were down below in the hold, stacked on top of each other, died within hours of departure. The children and the pregnant women died first. We saw them bring up the bodies and throw them into the water. A helicopter appeared overhead, and we thought we were finally safe, but after circling for a few minutes, it left." What is striking in this passage is the way it conveys a sense of resignation, a calculated anticipation of the failure to make it, and a quiet acceptance of the coming catastrophe. Basma's, that's her name, her real name, Basma's foreboding about drowning renders survival a matter of contingency. An unlikely event in the face of deliberate neglect. Indeed, the departing helicopter evidences this neglect, signifying the withdrawal of help and the denial of safety. Basma's account suggests that to abandon the refugees is already to make them disappear before they even vanish in the depths of the sea. Abandonment as disappearance defines the conditions of radical unsafety in which to disappear is not to be saved, yet continue to exist. Interestingly, the ship is also what makes them dead before they drown. Literally, some die under the deck, and symbolically, once at sea, they lose their political life, unable to claim due rights. The ship functions, therefore, as a technology that effects their demise while still ostensibly providing mobility to the bodies who have already vanished. Aptly called a death trap, it is paradoxically a vehicle that both moves and stills, mediates and withholds movement, providing an infrastructure of escape and capture. The refugees on the boat are quite literally bodies in motion, beyond the safety of seaworthy vessels and the protections granted by international legal frameworks. The recurring images of the ship in Book 5 work to expose the normative character of the conditions of unsafety and unsavability under which the refugees embark on their journeys. Book 5 represents the seascape as a site of familiar and quotidian disasters, contemplated from ashore with a sense of familiarity that renders them totally unexceptional. Quote, "They sat, the three of them, it's Matteo, Pietro, his father, and a camp doctor, eating and watching the sea through the window. In the distance, a boat circled the water. Coast Guard, Matteo said. No, that is the Carabinieri, the police, the doctor argued. Wrong, Pietro said, squinting his old eyes. It is a private boat, one of the rescue volunteers. The doctor volunteered at the refugee camp, and old as he was, he went out with the rescue boats daily to search for capsized migrant boats." What is striking in these passages is not only the way the novel inscribes refugees' unsafety into the texture of the aquatic vistas, but also how these rising and dipping boats address and speak of assumptions and expectations, their presence paradoxically indicative of how normalized and also ubiquitous the distressed migrant boats have become, and more significantly yet, of how the refugees' systemic deprivation of safety is taken for granted as something unfortuitous, something reckoned with, and something matter-of-factly anticipated. The migrant and the rescue boats tell us something about the ways border regimes enlist unsafety as a means of control and regulation that require no human actors for their enactment and operation. Habila's travelers evidence how the distribution of safety across bodies redefines borders and border crossing. Unsavable bodies demonstrate how conditions of radical unsafety get to be mobilized in the service of migration control and the regulation of movement. The rising and dipping vessels, continually on the lookout for distressed migrant boats, are revealing in three respects. For one, they speak of failed crossings. always looming on the horizon and indicative of how this Mediterranean border comes to be controlled by the very bodies not subject to saving, whose foundering reproduces and enacts the border and keeps it uncrossed. For another, they expose how the migrants become a body of control. Aiming to cross, they are simultaneously producing and holding their movement, embodying it and constituting both its boundary and its terminus. In a startling sense, the body becomes the border. Thus, to be unsaved and unsavable is not an outcome of control, but its means and precondition. There is therefore something tragic, outrageous, as well as banal about Pietro Matteo and the doctor sitting at home doing the guessing and impassively contemplating the marine horizon in anticipation of drowning migrants, pondering the readiness of the rescue boats to assist vessels in distress, but thereby also laying bare the paradoxical logic underlying these aquatic vistas. The migrants are not helped to safely cross the sea. They are offered help only when they end up unable to complete unsafe crossings. Having already been deprived of safety before the capsized boats secure the attention of rescue vessels. The assistance offered in conditions of emergency effectively conceals this prior state of unsafety, turning the rescue operations not only into spectacles of heroic struggle amidst the ferocity of the sea and sheer misfortune, but also into an end in itself and a sufficient remedy to singular incidents. What this saving leaves unsaved and thus also unchallenged is precisely the refugees' condition of systemic vulnerability, which both precedes and succeeds their maritime ordeals. Travelers conveys the sense of bewilderment at the practice of saving that does not extend further than the realm of the sea. It implicitly critiques the border regimes that have elevated saving into a value detached from the bodies and material realities it purports to serve. It registers exasperation at the resurgent European isolationism, it's a quote from Helmreich, that continues to view refugees as the empty bearers, to quote Bochum again, of the salvation value, which masks that prior vanishing and distribution of safety. For this critique to work, however, Habila needs to shift the critical focus from the proximity to death, seen as the defining aspect of blackness, towards the proximity to life. Habila's novel renders life into living itself to underscore the significance of protracting and or sustaining life, so that scenes of rescue can be staged and salvation value generated. What is at stake in Habila's insistence on the refugees' proximity to life rather than death is the way border regimes subject refugees to the harrowing ordeal of maritime crossing, simultaneously putting a political premium on their living and surviving. It is saving that redirects the Mediterranean afterlife of slavery towards life rather than death. Saving needs surviving, even if some lives are lost along the way. Saving calls for living bodies whose surviving can retrospectively testify to the success of rescue efforts and justify the costs incurred. We can see this logic taken to extremes in the politics of Frontex. The exorbitant amounts of money which go not only into the policing of the EU borders, but also into the surveillance of refugee life, how it progresses from one shore to another in the Mediterranean, are stunning. The annual budget of the agency rose from 142 million euros in 2015 to 460 million euros in 2020. Some of this money has been spent on drones Frontex aims to use to patrol the maritime frontier. In October 2020, for example, it granted contracts to Airbus and an Israeli weapons manufacturer, each worth 50 million euros. The use of the drones by Frontex has been criticized by NGOs for, among others, leading to the abandonment of migrants at sea and thus the evasion of the responsibility to assist them in distress. While the EU claims that the air surveillance will work to save lives, it in fact orchestrates a perverse spectacle by the agents of the EU security regime. It is this shift from being and acting at sea to watching from afar that powerfully registers the turn to the proximity of life and living. In the peculiar moral and monetary economy underlying the border regimes as they currently operate in the Mediterranean, survivors are much more vital to their maintenance than the bodies sunk to the bottomless depths. Juma, hapless Nigerian refugee who survives the maritime crossing, comes closest to embodying and recognizing the moral and economic value of continuing to live in the face of unlivability. On the last pages of the novel, Juma gives an account of his ordeals at sea and on land. After he relates the gruesome details of the passage, he asks rhetorically, "Why did I survive? I often wonder." Seeking to understand the sense of his survival that he sees so compromised by the unfreedom he's plunged into the moment his life is no longer imperiled at sea, Juma goes on hunger strike in protest against the inhuman treatment he receives and the impending deportation he awaits. As the deportation is bungled and Juma returns to the removal center, as the place is perniciously called, no one comes to save him when he gradually withers in the cell of the detention center. Juma's stormy passage speaks of the significance of life over the necropolitical undoing which marks Southern Europe's maritime realms. In the wake of the slave trade, as it materializes in the waters of the Mediterranean, saved life makes more political and economic sense than death. As Juma pungently puts it, quote, "I see, we are the TV, a reality show about survival." Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eva and Anna, for really interesting papers which riffed off each other and often used very similar scholarship. We'll take questions for about 10 minutes and then we'll go for a slightly late lunch, but that'll give us at least a chance for 2 or 3 questions. If that's okay, Judith, 10 minutes? Yep. Any questions at all? Sabina's got a question.
Yeah, thank you for these papers. And I share Ellen's feeling that they really sort of talk to each other almost. I have a really basic question as far as these adaptations of the Raft goes, because I'm sort of, I'm not an art historian, so a lot of the stuff I hadn't seen before. So I'm stunned at the way that this Raft story is taken up as a metaphor for the suffering of Black people in the life and afterlife of slavery, because after all, if you'd be like really drastically mean, you could say it's a bunch of colonialists that died on the Raft. And so I'm just like completely at a loss to explain why this of all epic pictures is then taken to symbolize, in analogy, the plight of Black people in the Mediterranean. I just don't have an explanation, so I thought maybe you would.
Of course, not an excuse, but I'm not also an art historian. Not an excuse. I believe that it has to do with the fact that there is a Black figure there, which was included later in a later study for the painting. In a way to give voice to to Géricault's abolitionist inclinations. Of course, through its pyramid structure, there are in the painting there are 2 pyramids. If you can recall, there's the structure of 2 pyramids, and the Black sailor is at the pinnacle of one of the pyramids. So in a way, of course, our eye is directed towards that figure, and because of the absence also of Black figures in that period's art, of course, you have Black figures, but they always tend to be portrayed in like in specific roles, to adorn, or to act as or to be like property, somebody's property, or the maid, or like I'm thinking of Olympia, for example. In a way, that was used as a way to that was a black figure with a sort of an agency, but still that it represented hope, but everyone knew that that was not going to turn out. They were not going to be saved. So I think, but of course, I focused on the adaptations in terms of refugee crisis, and that is your point, why it resonated so much. I think it has to do with the water, the sea, how people die at sea if they are not rescued. But if you, I'm thinking, for example, of Wittgen's The Raft of George W. Bush. It's a different take on the Raft of the Medusa. So it has been, its iconicity has been used for many socially engaged kind of interventions. In this way, I think it has to do with a black figure, and the water, and how the black figure at the top would be like a metaphor or symbol for something. Géricault is very interesting also in this respect. I was this weekend, sorry for sharing this sort of personal information, visiting a museum in our national palace in Portugal, in Lisbon, Palácio da Pena, and it was interesting that he had like a study of a black figure there. So he did lots of studies of black figures before he did this actually. So, and that picture by Géricault in the Palácio not Palácio da Pena, Palácio da Ajuda in Lisbon was there, owned by the king and the queen of Portugal, as a statement of abolitionist also statement. So in a way, yeah. It's
like a really long discussion.
It's part of the collection, and in a way, in the whole collection of Palácio da Ajuda, it's the only black figure. And people, I was surprised at people, who is this figure? Who is this? In a way, yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I answered.
No, I think as Sabina says, it's an ongoing discussion. Any other questions, especially for Théodore, if there's a question for Théodore, but any other questions? I don't. You have a comment. Yeah, well, we'll take a comment, and then maybe there'll be a question for these people that they can answer.
Thank you, Sabina, for asking the question. Okay, we are art historians. I'm an art historian, by the way. We are to blame. The presence of a black figure did exist in art, but we art historians pretended that it's not there, and we didn't talk about it until an African-American artist in the US worked about it and had an exhibition in the US, and the exhibition came to Musée d'Orsay and was called the Black Model. And it made a big deal in France because the way we treat gender and race in France is very different than in the US, and even our President Macron is blaming the American ideas having a bad impact on the French Academy. As why did this painting inspired people to talk about the refugee crisis? One reason could be the sea and the black figure, but in my personal humble opinion, I think here we talk about play of power. It was painted by powerful white man presenting the death of the colonizer, while here we have people speaking about the weak and the colonized using the same tool. And thank you.
It's wonderful to have an art historian in the room. Any more questions at all? Oh, there's one there in the front row.
No, just a reminder. I mean, you mentioned you may have mentioned the Left to Die boat as well by Charles Haller. So this is, maybe there are students in the room, so this could also be important to have a look at. Charles Haller, founder of forensic oceanography, and the Left to Die boat, and this surveillance, in fact, space. And so there is no way that they could have not been seen on that boat in the middle of that sea. So there is that whole,
If I might If I might just respond to what you said, I know about this Left to Die boat and the work that was done by Heller and Pizzani. And actually, I think that the case is a perfect illustration of one of the points I'm making. How what is happening at sea redefines refugees as those who failed to arrive, because that boat never failed to arrive. I mean, it drifted back to Libya, yes. And this is something completely new, I think, in how we not only think but allow to be done to people who are refugees and seek protection somewhere else. I mean, arrival is inscribed into the definition of a refugee, moving from place A to place B. This is not happening, very often not happening in the maritime context. Yes, so this case is really illustrative of the problem. Thank you.
A final question. This one in the front row, just along from you.
Yeah, well, if there's time, it's just a comment on this conversation, ongoing conversation about why using the Raft of the Medusa as a reference. I think it has also to do with adapting something which is iconic and which, for two reasons. One is you don't have to. You have to say something different from the original, and you have to look back on the original from the perspective of the present, so that you reinterpret why it has become iconic, and this is related to what you said, and also you take a different direction with different characters taking precedence. So it's just from my point of view.
Time for a question for either if there is one on the bulk of the paper. I've got one if no one else has. Yeah, I'm always intrigued by the comparison between slavery or enslavement and the refugee crisis. I know why it's there, but there are problematics to it. Gigantic problematics to it. And I was and your paper dealt with those to an extent, but I'm wondering whether you come to a point in that comparison where it doesn't do justice to either the enslaved Africans or to the refugees. I just wanted you to comment on that, maybe. It's a big question, but I just thought that your paper was asking the question, and I was just feeling that you hinted at some answers, but maybe if you could share with us.
You are absolutely right. This is a very problematic issue, and it's one of the reasons why I drew on Yogita Goyal, because I think she's one of the few, as far as I know, scholars who is, cautioning about these analogies. The reason why I looked at this analogy and wanted to see whether there is some analogy, how it can be seen, how it can be interpreted, where it can be found, was that there is reference to the slave trade in the novel I was analyzing. Plus, there are frequent references to the slave trade in the press. For example, the press articles that comment on what is happening to refugees, and I'm sure many have read such press articles where the tragedies happening at sea are explicitly compared to the Middle Passage and the slave trade. And there is a group of scholars who are also, making these analogies and working on these analogies. I have not really referred to them. Christina Sharp would be one of them, certainly, but there is a number of others. But it is. You are absolutely right. It is problematic in many ways.
We've got 2 days to deal with that problematic, so I'm sure we will bring it up again. Thanks so much to Anna and Eva for excellent.